This video is going to look at the impacts of a tariff on the open market for a good, and then also the changes to consumer and producer surplus and overall market efficiency that occur as a result. So the first thing that we need to know is that a tariff is a tax on foreign goods and services. So it's only imported goods that are actually affected directly by a tariff. Tariff is designed to increase the price of a foreign good or a service so that the competing domestic good receives a price benefit. The other thing to note is that it's also an important source of revenue for the government. There are a few different reasons why the government might choose to impose a tariff on a foreign good. It may be to protect a infant industry that's just been developed, or it might be to protect an industry that's a source of national pride, such as what occurred in the motor vehicle industry. The government decided that it was very important to our national psyche that we had a motor vehicle industry. That it put in a raft of protectionist policies to actually ensure that that occurred. Looking at the diagram here, we can see that the domestic country has a comparative disadvantage in the production of motor vehicles, and we can see that because the world price is actually below what the domestic price is. Now, in a normal open market, we would see a few things occur as a result. We'd actually see the production of cars locally contract to Q1, and we see the consumption of cars increase from QD to Q2 here. So the difference between production and consumption in this point is made up by imports. So this market is still relatively efficient. We're still operating without any deadweight loss, and even though domestic producers are losing out considerably, that difference is more than made up by the fact that we're still importing and consumption is increased by such a considerable amount. Now, if the government decided to protect this industry by placing a tariff on it, what they're going to do is they're going to place a tax on this good which will increase the price to above the world price and still below the domestic price. Okay, so we'll label this T here, and we'll call this tariff out here. So what has happened is that really the foreign supply of a good has increased by the amount of the tariff or the tax on the imported good, which has resulted in a price increase. So imports that are sold on the domestic market will increase, and they'll also be sold at a higher price, which is price PT on the diagram. Now, what's going to occur in terms of production and consumption? Well, domestic production is going to increase from Q1 out to Q3, and domestic consumption will decrease from Q2 to Q4. Now, in effect, what's happening is that domestic producers are gaining a larger slice of this market, and so they'll be able to sell more at a higher price. So their producer surplus will increase relative to previously when we were just going off the world price, and consumer surplus is actually going to decrease as well. Now, really, we need to show the impact of consumer surplus and producer surplus on this market to illustrate whether there's going to be any deadweight loss at all. First thing we need to establish, though, is that the value of imports has actually decreased. So the amount that we're importing is decreased. That value there, so the imports that we're receiving has fallen from Q1, Q2 to Q3, Q4. And that has important implications for what we're going to look at in a moment. Okay, so as usual, we're going to label our producer and consumer surplus on this diagram. So I'm going to move in alphabetical order. I'm going to go area A, area B, area C, area D, area E, area F, G, H, I. Now, all these will be able to have a certain role in a moment. The first thing we need to know is that Q3, Q4 can also be illustrated by the areas F and G. So imports are equal to Q3, Q4, or F and G. So essentially what was happening before the tariff was put in place. So before the tariff was implemented, the area of consumer surplus was the area A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. So that's quite a significant area which has been taken up by consumer surplus, and we know that because of the relative disadvantage that Australia has in producing motor vehicles, so we do need to gain most of this good from imports. Producer surplus prior to the tariff was area I. Now, what's changed since the tariff has been introduced? So after tariff, we've seen a price increase which has reduced consumption and increased production. So naturally, we're going to assume that consumer surplus is going to decrease and producer surplus is going to increase. So we have a look at the actual areas here. Consumer surplus has decreased to area A, B, C. Producer surplus has now actually increased to area D and I. We still see, though, there are some areas that are not accounted for as yet. We know that Q3, Q4 is actually still taken up by imports, right? So area F and G. What about areas E and H? Well, we're actually going to illustrate the inefficiency of a tariff with these areas. So area E and area H are actually deadweight loss, right? There is inefficiency in this market. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shade these areas to really illustrate this for you. So area E, area H is deadweight loss, which is equal to these two areas here. So obviously there is some inefficiency in this market because of the deadweight loss that exists. So the overall welfare of society is reduced. We've got adverse effects of a tariff which will ripple throughout the economy and will decrease production and consumption in other sectors of the economy. That's because even though they've decreased the imports in the protected industry and allowed domestic production to increase, it actually results in lower exports for other producers and may result in a net decrease in employment. Really, the big effect of the tariff is distorting resource allocation, as we can see through the deadweight loss here. And so clearly, a tariff will result in a net welfare loss for the economy.